Hello everyone, and welcome to a sermon sidecar. This past Sunday, we were in 1 Timothy 5:1 all the way to 6:2. Because it was a longer passage, I kind of knew there would always be a sidecar with this one because there's just a lot to cover. And one specific thing that stuck out that I didn't get to touch upon was the seeming contradiction that exists in this passage in Paul's instructions for the church. So in verse 1, Paul specifically says or tells Timothy, he says, "Do not rebuke." You can find that in 1 Timothy 5:1. He says, "Do not rebuke an older man." And then he gives the familial language that we talked about on Sunday. But remember that phrase, right? Do not rebuke. And then we jump down to chapter 5, verse 20. Different section, but he's now talking about the elders. And Paul tells Timothy, "As for those who persist in sin, rebuke. As for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all." And so we have this interesting parallel that is happening here in this seeming contradiction linguistically, where Paul in verse 1 says, "Do not rebuke." Paul in verse 20 says, "Do rebuke." He specifically commands Timothy to rebuke. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with it when it seems that Scripture is contradicting itself? And really the first thing you want to do, especially if it looks like an English contradiction, is go back to the original language to see if there are different words that we translate the same, and see from there if that changes the contradiction, if that fixes the contradiction. So if we do that for this passage, if we go back to the original language, in verse 1 of the chapter we find "do not epiplesso," that word that we translate rebuke. And that is a unique word in Scripture. It is only used here. And it is used normally to mean beat upon. We get this in other Greek sources where it means to beat upon someone, to strike someone, to punch someone. In fact, one of the places that it is used in reference to on some of the Greek lexicons is talking about boxing matches, talking about fights that would break out. So he says, "Do not epiplesso," this word that means to beat upon. So this is a much more violent and corrective form of rebuking. It has the image of rebuking someone with actual, tangible, physical violence. And when our words would get to that point, it's this idea of abusive correction that doesn't care about the person, doesn't care about the outcome, just wants the behavior to stop. So do not epiplesso. When we get all the way down to verse 20, Paul does not use epiplesso. It means that when it says that it's only used in 5:1, that's the only place in the New Testament it's used. Instead, in 5:20, Paul uses elenko to rebuke, which means to show faults, to make someone aware of their faults. And so elders are still corrected in front of the presence of all. They are still shown this harsher correction, if you will. But it is not an abusive correction. It is not a violent correction. It is not a correction that does not care about them as a person. It's not a correction that could be likened to a boxing match. It instead is them having their faults pointed out publicly so that the congregants may learn from their sin, from their example in sin. And so what at first appears as a contradiction isn't a contradiction. It's two different types of rebuking. One that is violent and abusive and that Paul explicitly commands us not to engage in, and one that is simply pointing out faults, either publicly for elders or privately for other congregants, pointing out faults, showing faults, making people aware of faults. One is abusive, one simply points out what is wrong. We are called to calmly rebuke, to calmly point out faults, not to abusively beat upon our brothers and sisters. And that's a pretty simple thing that we learned from this passage that can be lost with the English language. So I hope that helped you understand that passage, helped you not see it as a contradiction any longer, and I hope it blesses you and encourages you. See you next time.